Hi, I'm Ben Graham, and welcome to our second lecture on the political economy of international migration. Right, so we started out the first lecture in this series, right, is all about the economic costs and benefits of migration, kind of who's winning and losing economically when individuals move from one country to another. So it's very much a political economy lecture in kind of the econ sense. We're just looking at how migration affects kind of the dollars and cents heading into people's bank accounts, right? If we look at the politics of migration, though, that's only a very small piece of the puzzle. And so I'm going to break this lecture into 6 parts. And really, I'm only going to cover 5 of them because I think we've done a reasonably good job with the economic costs and benefits already, right? And so if we transfer that economic framework of looking at the dollars and cents going into people's pockets, we can say, well, one baseline kind of expectation as we think about who supports increasing migration and who supports restricting migration more, we can think about, well, who's winning and losing economically, right? But that's only going to explain just a little bit of the variance, or maybe a medium-sized chunk of the variance, but it's certainly not going to tell us the whole story about who supports migration politically, right? And when we talk about the politics of migration, to be clear here, we're mostly talking about the politics of migration in migrant receiving countries, right? That if we look at why labor does not flow around the globe nearly as easily as finished goods and services or nearly as easily as capital, right? Labor, human beings flow around the globe and move across borders much less easily, much less freely. And the thing that blocks human beings from being able to move across borders when they want to are usually restrictions on inward migration. So the country to which a migrant would like to move and where they would like to settle, or even just would like to visit as a tourist, often refuses to let them across the border, right? So that's where the restrictions are. It's not the case that there are only very rarely restrictions on whether people can leave a country. And we certainly have seen examples of that historically, and folks fleeing the Soviet Union across the Berlin Wall into West Germany and these kinds of things. But usually migration restrictions are about wealthier migrant receiving countries putting up barriers about who can come into the country. So that's sort of the framework here. And the economic costs and benefits, sort of like when voters are saying, oh, do I support increasing or decreasing the amount of migration coming into the United States or coming into Western Europe, coming into Japan or South Korea, or coming into South Africa or coming into Brazil, any of these sort of destination countries, into Mexico from Central America. Economic costs and benefits are only a piece of what shapes an individual's policy preferences here. So let's run through some of the other things. We're going to talk about the political preferences of migrants. So once a migrant comes in, particularly in a democratic context, if that's a person who's going to move, become a citizen and gain voting rights, then suddenly their political preferences matter a lot in terms of how their presence affects native-born residents, right? So we'll talk about what happens if migrants may have systematically different policy preferences from native-born residents and what kind of tensions that might generate. We'll talk about security and terrorism concerns, right? That if you think about, especially, if you think about the views in Western Europe in 2013, 2014, or the views in the United States in 2002, 2003, right, about migration, it was a lot to do with people's fears about terrorism. And then if you look at the role that nationalism and racism play explicitly and implicitly, right? So certainly people's views about, about race and about the nation as sort of sometimes an ethnically based or religiously based construct, and kind of the what groups are allowed to live in what territory kinds of ideas, those shape individuals' policy preferences around the globe. And sometimes you will see policy preferences that are driven by racism, by nationalism, being recast or explained, as actually concerns about the economy, or actually this is just a concern about political preferences. It's not It's not about race, or it's not about nationalism. But so we will see these things sometimes driving policy preferences in ways that are obscured, but they are very potent forces, right? We'll talk about moral responsibilities toward refugees, right? When folks are talking about how many refugees they would like to see resettled in the United States or in any other country, often the individuals expressing preferences one way or the other on refugees may not be driven, again, by sort of pocketbook voting concerns, right? But there's a sense of moral responsibility that drives policy preferences. And similarly, we're going to talk about the moral implications of cross-border inequalities more broadly, economic inequalities and inequalities in terms of the political institutions that people are living under, and quality of life more broadly. What does it mean? What are the moral implications of having the quality of life be much better and having life be much easier if you're born on one side of a border than another? Okay, so we're going to run through a lot of pretty diverse terrain here. Let's talk about the political preferences first. So what if migrants have systematically different preferences than native-born residents? Which is to say, if we kind of think about on any given political issue, there might be a whole spectrum of people. Let's just take something simple like the optimal income tax rate. You might have some people who believe we shouldn't pay any taxes at all, and we should have complete sort of pure form libertarianism, really minimal taxes. And then somebody else thinks we should have a very high level of taxation and large government programs, right? And anywhere in between. And let's say, that the average native-born citizen prefers a 28% top marginal tax rate, and the average immigrant is actually more libertarian in caste and prefers a top marginal rate of 18% or something. If you have a lot of immigrants move into a community and gain citizenship and voting rights, that's going to lead to probably a lower tax rate over time as more of those new citizens with preferences for lower taxes come in, right? And so for native-born citizens, particularly those who prefer high taxes, right, more immigration means a tax policy that's farther away from their preference. So you can think about it as like, well, that's a reason to oppose immigration. But on the flip side, it's also, if you are somebody who currently favors low taxes and you know that these incoming new citizens are likely to favor your priority, well, that leads you to be more supportive of inward immigration. You're like, ooh, more immigration means more policy outcomes closer to my preference. So how an individual citizen expects that more immigration is going to affect the domestic policy environment is going to have a lot to do with whether they support or oppose more inward immigration. Right? But in a democratic context, if you change the makeup of the voting population, you're going to change the makeup of the policy outcomes that follow. And there's going to be winners and losers from that in a political economy context that we can model. And certainly you all have read a lot, I expect, of the different commentary on how the changing racial makeup of the United States and the role of new immigrants in particular as voters in the United States may reshape political outcomes in different states and different types of elections, their party preference, all these other things. So let's talk about the security and terrorism piece too here, right? One way a country protects itself from foreign threats is to limit travel and migration, right? And so if we think about strategies to prevent another September 11th, or to prevent the types of terror attacks that were hitting Western Europe 5-6 years ago, 7-8 years ago, even now, I guess. Some of this is to prevent people who want to harm your country from being able to enter your country in the first place. And this is tricky because on the one hand, when you have policies that are admitting refugees from countries like Syria and Iraq and Afghanistan, and you're admitting those refugees to the United States or to elsewhere, those are people who are often very directly the targets of organizations like ISIS or Al-Qaeda. And then you also have, US security forces uncovering ISIS documents that talk about the possibility of having ISIS members pretend to be refugees and enter the United States to conduct attacks on the US homeland, right? And so both of these things are true, that we are offering refugee protections to people from countries with ongoing conflicts in order to protect those individuals from those conflicts. And then there are security risks that come with admitting folks from countries with ongoing conflicts or countries where there are groups operating who wish to launch attacks on the United States or other countries that are receiving those migrants, right? And so in recent decades, that conversation has mostly been around groups like Al Qaeda and ISIS, but historically it's covered a fairly wide range of groups. And so, this is one of those things that's it's not economic at all, right? But it's going to shape how people perceive, how severe people perceive the threat of terrorism to be, and how they weigh the risks of kind of an increased probability of attack on the homeland versus the moral responsibility to help people escape conflict zones and help escape persecution in other countries is going to shape how they want to handle these risks in terms of immigration policy. And then we have nationalism, racism, and religious intolerance or tolerance, right? That human beings have very deep-seated views about in-group and out-group, and people like them versus people not like them. Xenophobia, I think, fits in here, which is sort of fear of difference and otherness and foreignness in general. And, nationalism is essentially a set of ideas about what groups of people should reside in and govern what territory, right? The whole idea of a homeland or a nation, right? Are these ideas they're historical. We talk about, there's a famous phrase in the social sciences about nations as imagined communities. And, that imagined community has people who are inside the community and outside the community, and that in-group, out-group, those dynamics and those beliefs shape people's preferences about who should be admitted across the border to reside in a country and who should not be. And in some cases, who should be expelled from countries, right? There's many countries, including, ongoing today, where there is ethnic cleansing of various types that goes on, right? I happen to have done a fair amount of work looking at the conflict between Armenia and Azerbaijan over Nagorno-Karabakh, or sometimes called Artsakh, which is a disputed territory, which is essentially an ethnic Armenian enclave within what used to be the Azeri Soviet Socialist Republic. And right around the time that Azerbaijan and Armenia were becoming independent countries and the Soviet Union was collapsing, right? That autonomous region within the Azeri Soviet Socialist Republic was trying to either gain independence or join Armenia. And there was a war fought in the early 90s, and then just a war fought again a few months ago in late 2020 over that territory, and a lot about folks from which nation, from which sort of ethnic group should be able to reside there. So this is going to shape, people's views, right? And these beliefs, particularly in the United States context, in the Western European context, it is not considered permissible in most political discourse to use racism as a justification for your policy preferences about migration. But nonetheless, racism in particular and religious intolerance as well play significant roles in driving people's views about. And so often, if folks have views about migration that are largely shaped by racism or religious intolerance, they will justify their opposition to migration, increased migration, with reference to sort of some of these other issues we've been talking about. But these are powerful forces that shape people's political views and thus the policy outcomes that we see. And certainly racism has played a much more explicit role in US immigration policy historically, in European immigration historically. If you look at US immigration policy going back, and in some of this was discussed in the previous lecture when we were kind of discussing sort of the different, the numbers of immigrants coming in different groups, you know, this was very explicitly racist in origin. And now racism still plays a role, but it is a somewhat more hidden role. I mean, which is not to say that there aren't folks in political discourse making explicitly racist or religiously intolerant arguments. But for lack of a better word, the mainstream political discourse tends to try not to rest their arguments on racism and religious intolerance explicitly. Moral responsibilities toward refugees, right? So if you look at refugee policy in the United States, right, it's US policy to grant asylum to anyone who arrives at the US border and requests asylum on the basis of a well-founded fear of persecution on account of race, religion, nationality, or membership in a particular social group or political opinion. And particularly this membership in a political social group has been defined quite differently over time. And, you know, and there are cases now where folks are claiming and receiving asylum and I should, you know, before our discussion, I'm going to look up some of the history on this and see how far back this goes, but on the basis of gender discrimination, right? That people who are, have been subject to violence on the basis of their gender are then requesting asylum in the United States, right? But certainly we can think about this as folks who were persecuted for being capitalist under the Soviet Union or were persecuted for being Jewish at various points. And so that's kind of, you know, a lot of the origin of refugee and asylum law is based after World War II. And so persecution of Jewish people being very central, obviously there, although, you know, obviously the Roma and other groups were persecuted within the Holocaust as well. But this is not, there's no numerical cap on the number of refugees that the US can admit, right? Or is legally required to admit the way our own laws are written, right? And so this is a individual level case by case policy. So whereas we may say, oh, there's, you know, we're going to issue, you know, 650,000 family reunification visas this year. And okay, yeah, you may qualify for family reunification, but we already issued all of our visas for this year. You have to wait until next year. Or we've got these high skilled visas, the H-1Bs and stuff. Sorry, we've already hit our quota for this year. You just don't get one. Yes, you're qualified, but you just don't get one. It's not supposed to work that way for refugees, right? It's not, well, yes, you're going to be murdered because you belong to the wrong political party, but you can't come and have asylum anyway because we've hit our threshold for the year. It's just supposed to be like we take the merits of each case individually. But there is sort of, for lack of a better word, a cap on the number of refugees that many voters think is okay to have come in to the United States in a given year. You know, if it's 50,000, 100,000 people a year, they're, you know, people are pretty supportive. But then if it's going to be 500,000 people a year or 1 million people a year, right? Do voters still support that in the same way? Many voters, you know, there's sort of there's a number they're comfortable with and a number they're not. And right now, the way our law is written, it's not about the number coming in every year. And it's really about, well, how many of these people who are facing well-founded fears of persecution can actually make it all the way to the US border and ask for asylum, right? That's not an easy thing to do. Notice we don't allow you to show up at our embassy overseas and request asylum. You got to make it to the US border, right? And that's a really hard thing to do from many parts of the world, right? Okay, it might be that the Assad regime in Syria is going to kill you, but can you actually make it to the US border to request asylum? Well, that's going to be tough, right? So as, you know, and this is partly why, you know, we'll talk about this, why the Syrian civil war generated so many asylum seekers in Western Europe, because their asylum laws sort of generally speaking work the same way, where each individual case is supposed to be evaluated on its merits. There's not like a cap on the number of people who can get asylum each year. And the civil war in Syria was somewhat unusual because prior to the outbreak of the civil war, Syria was, a pretty high income country, sort of an upper middle income country. And so there were a whole lot of people in Syria who not only had very well-founded fears of persecution, right, and had, were going to be murdered if they didn't leave the country, uh, but they also, and this is the unusual part, there's lots of civil wars that generate a lot of people who need to flee for their own safety. But a lot of the people who needed to flee Syria actually had the financial means to get to Western Europe, and some of them all the way to the United States, right? The reason a whole smuggling industry sprung up in the Mediterranean was because there were people who had a lot of money to pay to smugglers, right? So anybody with a boat could suddenly make a lot of money carrying migrants to Western Europe. And they could do so because there were a lot of people who wanted to go, and those were people with money, right? And that was the key thing that was somewhat unusual about the Syrian civil war, right? Is the financial resources that many of those migrants had access to. And which led then to a huge number of migrants reaching Western Europe, and we bumped up against this sort of what's the average sort of European citizen, what's their tolerance for, what's their willingness to admit numbers of refugees, right? Like, okay, the first few thousand people that show up, yes, absolutely, let's let these people in. They clearly need our help. Like there's a moral obligation here. But then as the numbers go up and up and up, people are like, wait, I don't know that I want to, this moral obligation is becoming more costly than I'm willing to pay, right? So this is not something I think we've worked out how to deal with, right? That what do we do when the number of people who deserve asylum by our own definitions in the migrant receiving countries, in the refugee receiving countries, when the number of people who meet our criteria for admission exceed the number of people that sort of the average voter wants to admit? What do we do in that situation? We haven't squared that circle. And then I want to talk a little bit more broadly about the moral implications of cross-border inequalities, right? So in some sense, asylum and refugee policy is the extreme case here. Okay, this is someone who's going to die or be thrown in jail if they don't, if we don't get them out of their home country and into a destination country. But there are a lot of people whose lives are going to be much, much better if they can leave one country and go to another, right? We talked about some of these wage differentials being, 7, 10 times moving from one country to another. Your lifetime expected earnings go up by 7-fold or 10-fold. Those are just bonkers numbers, right? And this is sort of this, and if you read one of the optional readings for one of these migration lectures was a piece by Brian Kaplan about the open borders movement. There are a lot of other writers who write in the open borders movement, and they'll make this moral case for open borders around the idea that, look, most people who are poor throughout their lives are poor simply because they were born in a poor country. That if you look at like, what are the major determinants of whether somebody becomes wealthy or not in their lives? And you might think, okay, well, it's how hardworking is this person? And, what are their natural talents and abilities, right? And okay, those things matter, but man, a huge determinant. And then you think like, oh, well, are your parents rich? Were you born in a rich family? But, huge determinant is just simply, were you born in a wealthy country? Right? Your odds of becoming rich if you're born even to a poor family in the United States, if your parents are very poor in the United States, your odds of becoming wealthy are much, much higher than if you're born to an average income family in almost, in many, many, many countries in the world, right? So we may or may not be okay with the idea that somebody's lot in life, that whether or not they will be able to vote in free and fair elections and have a say in their own political lives, whether or not they will be subject to government harassment and imprisonment, whether or not they'll sort of have civil and political rights, whether or not they'll be able to earn a good living and, seek a good education, all of these different things, that is largely determined by what side of a border you're born on, right? Where geographically on the globe are you born dictates your lot in life. We might have a moral problem with that. And we might think that a more just world is one in which there is the idea of equality of opportunity is not just a within country concept, right? We talk a lot about that as kind of an American value in many contexts, that we'll talk about this idea that to whatever family you're born to in the United States, you should have an opportunity to thrive and excel and succeed. And we talk about equality of opportunity in the United States, but it's very clear. So we have plenty of inequality of opportunity within the United States, very extreme inequalities of opportunity within the United States. But even those pale in comparison to the inequalities of opportunities that exist across borders, right? And so our views on what the optimal number of migrants to admit to a wealthy country in a given year may be driven a lot by our moral feelings about cross-border inequality in general. Okay, so that's sort of, none of these things, I think, provide answers. They provide, they point to issues, right? They point to what the trade-offs are, to what the moral stakes of this policy area are. And, we cover migration very late in this class because the political economy tools are a little bit less useful here. And I hesitate to say it that way because I'm a political economist working in this area, right? And I wrote a whole book about essentially, the economic benefits to migrant receiving countries that come with, that come from having a diverse population of immigrants living in your country, and the ways that those immigrants help multinational firms then thrive abroad, right? And facilitate the integration of the global economy and the generation of global wealth, right? And I think that matters in this policy debate, but it's also been a challenging process for me as a scholar to recognize the limits on the impact that the economic knowledge that I create has on the policy debate. Because fundamentally, even like my own personal debate, like my own personal views on migration aren't really shaped primarily by all those economic benefits that I describe, right? Much more of my own personal political views on this are shaped by my feelings about the moral implications of cross-border inequalities, right? Like that weighs more heavily for me, right? So, you are in a school of international relations that is multidisciplinary, right? We're mostly political scientists here, but we at least ostensibly draw on other fields. And this is certainly an area where, okay, economics matter a lot in the migration debate. You'll hear about them a lot, but there's a lot for you to wrestle with that's not fundamentally economic at heart. And we will wrestle with this as a class all together. And I'm looking forward to the conversations we have around this. So thank you all for being with me.